George Miller, Chris Hemsworth, welcome to 7:30, and thank you for this transporting glory of a film that you've given us. The fifth story in the Mad Max series. A simple question, first of all. What's Furiosa about?
Well, it's on the surface, it's an odyssey. It's someone who's taken from her home in a dystopian world, but she's taken from a home called the Green Place, and from the age of 10 all the way through to 28, it's a story about her trying to get back home in this world called the Wasteland, and so it's an odyssey. It's pretty obvious that it's a story told over and over again throughout all cultures and all time, but this is our version of it, and I hope along the way it's about, you know, the way as the history man says at the beginning, as the world falls around us, how must we brave its cruelties? And I think that's falls into allegory, which is the main reason I keep coming back to these stories, because allegory is very seductive.
Chris, just tell us about your character, Dementus.
He's a complicated individual. He's a product of the wasteland, of this vicious, violent, harsh landscape, and certainly has suffered himself, and now through his actions, like most individuals in that space, it's brutal due to necessity, due to survival. There's no planning for a year from now, a month from now, or a week. It's how do I get through today? And so what most of them resort to is the brutal force and kill or be killed, and rule with an iron fist. And he's the leader of a large biker horde, very nomadic group of individuals who maraud from place to place, and this is his attempt at sort of domination and control, and amassing a sort of army of followers with him.
I read, George, that you originally didn't know who was going to play Dementus. You took a meeting with Chris. What is it that you saw in that meeting that told you?
Well, you never know who will play anybody really, or how they'll fit. It's all theory. But you know, obviously I knew of Chris's work, but we met, and we had this conversation the first time we met. And it wasn't that long. It was about an hour and a half. And through the conversation, I just realised, and I'm sorry to say this in front of you, but he's a person of many dimensions. Mm. And each one really took me aback. I thought, we talked about the world at large. We talked about work and the process of work, how he comes to the work, how he came to be doing the things that he does, and you know, even to some degree, I think about family. Anyway, by the time I thought, you know, the meeting was over, I thought, oh, the Venn diagram of the character and Chris has some overlap. I think then you read the screenplay, and your response to the screenplay really confirmed that. And so we started on the film together, and then I had the experience of working with you, and all the way through the process during that uncertain beginnings that you always have. No one knows what's going to happen. As I said, it's all theory, and then it becomes more concrete. And then I've spent, even though the shooting took, I guess, just over 6 months, the editing took a year. I've spent a year with not Chris, but Dementus, the character. I got to know him really well, every nuance, every micro experience,
muscle.
Everything.
Now, Chris, I read that in that period, before the shoot began, and then right in the lead up to the film, you felt like you hadn't completely captured who Dementus was.
Yeah.
How did you get it? Because it's there in the very first frame of the film. I know
thanks.
It's there. How did you get there?
It's interesting, you know, I kind of even find, I'd watch the film at the premiere or a film, or even watch a film years later and still discover things I wanted to try. You never quite complete the discovery, and that's part of the fun. But you often I have had a pretty strong instinct of who the character was and where I wanted to take it from the first read or the first couple of reads. By the time we started shooting, I'd had this script in my lap for 2 years, and so plenty of time to sort of ruminate and think about it. And even in the rehearsal process, we were continually talking about the scenes and the character. And about 2 weeks out, I really felt exactly what you were saying, which is I don't quite know where I want to head with this. I have a bunch of ideas, and they're sort of percolating, and they're trying to get along, and so on. But there was this sort of conflict, and George suggested, journaling and writing in character, which I hadn't done before. And I went home that night and woke up at sort of 12 o'clock, 1 a.m. and just got the notepad and just sort of pen to paper and started writing 4 or 5 pages and didn't think much of it, closed it, and it was in a half sleep state. Woke up the next morning and was really surprised about sort of what had come out. And I showed it to George, and I think what we both connected with was a lot of it was about who he was prior to where we see him in the film, and what experiences birthed this individual, and what kind of suffering had he endured and survived through, and that had transformed him emotionally and physically into what we see in the film.
The story gives us a bit of that, but not a lot. So you filled in the rest.
Yeah, and I think that was what was really nice, and it was allowing there to be ambiguity and questions raised or offered up to spur conversation from an audience. And anytime, I kind of was like, oh, well, we should articulate and say that. George is like, no, it's the less is more, little hints of it, and let people discover that and interpret it themselves. And that was a wonderful lesson in working with George, was just about, when and where and how much to offer up as far as ideas go and representations of ideas and characters. Now,
you had fallen in love with the idea of Mad Max seeing Fury Road, I understand, if that's correct. What is it? What was the draw for you? Why did you want to be there?
Oh, look, as an Australian, as an Australian actor, I think to be a part of a George Miller film, a Mad Max film, was always a dream come true. Fury Road was I had seen in London, and it was the first time in years, and I'd shot Thor and a number of other films. Every time I'd go and see a film, I would look and I wonder how they shot this, or what the camera angles were, or the music, and be aware of the sort of technicalities of it. It's the first time in years that I was really immersed in the experience and felt like an audience member again, and there was a purity to that. And I called my agent and I said, I have to work with George in some way. I'll do anything, if something comes up. And then, fortunate enough, probably a couple of years later, that this script came about.
So we've talked about the intensity, a little bit about the intensity of your character and his background, but of course we're also on set with these mass of vehicles and stunt operatives and a huge team and a vast location. How do you bring people to performance in the middle of all that activity?
Well, with difficulty, with a process that you have to kind of adjust to whatever the story is and the circumstances that you're working on. So I think it's going back to making sure that everybody has very clear and cohesive shared organising ideas. Everybody's working basically to the same principles. And that applies to cast, so that there's a deeper understanding of how the characters emerge, and more importantly, how they interact. I mean, and certainly it's with the actors, making sure that you're working with actors and they understand how everyone's working together. It's really important to work with actors who are very collaborative, because it's the collective effort is always greater than the individual. And so there's that, and that same thing happens with the crew. It's, I've always been interested in how really great teams of people work together. Just, you can't help it if you're making films. And so I've been very interested in how, say, really good sporting teams work together. From our medical days, how really great surgical teams work together. And there's a lot in common. And I think in Australia, without going on too long, I think in Australia, one of the things that sort of is in the flavour of our work is that there's a very relaxed discipline, non-hierarchical, so that there's everybody sort of senses what everyone else is doing, and it sort of works in a kind of harmony, and that's what you try to get on your set.
Chris, I wanted to ask you about the stunts, because they are obviously what we were partly talking about there. They are phenomenal. It's gripping, but it's also beautiful at the same time. You'd come from action movies. You understand how action movies work together. How was this different, if it was, in relation to the stunts?
Yeah, I think I've done a lot of films in the action space, and sometimes, often, it can feel like it's spectacle for the sake of the spectacle. Whereas I think what George is doing, everything is informing the story. It's supporting the character's journey, the arc. It has a reason. It's not just for, visual sort of aesthetics. And so I found the stunts were very character driven and motivated, and it was much easier to sort of be immersed in that and not just think, okay, I'm doing this, I'm driving here, It was about, well, my character wants X, Y, and Z, and this is where this is happening. This is my emotional state at this point. So it was a lot more laid into it than anything previously I had done in the action space.
And you really drove that chariot. That's not a plot spoiler.
I did, no.
Everyone's seen it in the trailer.
Yeah. There was a few. That actual motorbike had a radial engine from an aeroplane in it, and I think there were only 2 or 3 of them made. And it wasn't the funnest thing to drive. It wasn't the most practical instrument, but it looked pretty cool.
Now I know that the character, the Furiosa character, and obviously she's brilliantly played by Anna Taylor-Joy. Her intensity on screen is just magnificent. You wrote that backstory, I understand, when you were directing Fury or creating Fury Road. Did you always intend Furiosa to be its own film?
Yes, if contingent on Fury Road working and getting enough traction, that was the intention. We also
which happily it did.
Yeah, well, remains to be seen. But Fury Road.
Yes,
yeah.
I beg your pardon.
And so we said, okay, we'll go ahead and do it. Meantime, we were still sorting things out with the studio, which was pretty dysfunctional when we made Fury Road. It's the complete opposite now. They've been amazing, very, very supportive and of the filmmaking process, and kind of trusted us to do the work, and we ended up with Fury Road, Furiosa. It was a difficult film to make, just logistically, the usual things with big films like this, making sure that everyone's safe at every level of the thing, dealing with weather and, of course, COVID and stuff. And eventually we're here today, having just finished the film a week ago.
Which is amazing. Yeah. So it's extremely fresh. Chris just referred to the fact, of course, the desire of an actor to be in a George Miller film. It's always weird having people talk about you in the third person. But the question I wanted to ask about that is, in what way is Mad Max uniquely Australian?
Well, it's...
if it is.
It is. I'm happy to say that. The first Mad Max, I was very interested in the language of cinema. That's how I first came to movies. And I was one of those who recognised or saw that the syntax of movies was basically defined in the silent era. So I was always interested in the staple of kinetic cinema, action movies, Buster Keaton, and the rest of them, Harold Lloyd and whatever, and following that through. That's what got me into that. But by the time it came to do the first Mad Max, it arose out of the culture I understood. I didn't understand what I was doing at the time, but when it went to Japan, it was seen as a samurai movie, and so on and so on. But the French saw it as a Western on wheels. And suddenly I realised, we've tapped into a pretty universal archetypes here. And hence I got into Joseph Campbell and mythology and so on. I'm still processing all of that. What makes me so pleased about this movie, and please, we never discussed accent, but you decided to do it in the Australian accent, an accent that was familiar from your grandfather. Is that correct?
Yeah. I was listening to. I didn't want to do a sort of contemporary Australian accent, but it needed to be Australian, and so I was listening to a lot of kind of interviews back in the sort of 70s, 80s, and there was a slight different sort of tone and nasality to things, and then
that's Dementus in the room right now. That just gave me.
And then my grandpa used to, hello, how's it going? Good. Had this real kind of there was something fun and joyful about it, but when with the right sort of cadence, it could also be a little aggressive. And not that he was an aggressive man, but I wanted there to be something a little piercing and different, but also familiar, but not specific to a time period. So it was a sort of a creation, but in a few different sort of influences.
And how did you find it? You were listening to news broadcasts?
Yeah,
was it?
just interviews and broadcasts and older films, and I remember listening to sort of the horse race, commentators. Hey, coming around the bend, and there was and that kind of stuck in my head. I don't know. There was a gathering of a lot of different influences. But my grandfather was probably my brother's hear it and they go, that's Keith.
But it came out like on day one, it was there. And the interesting thing about it was that way back in the late 70s, the American release, the American English-speaking American version was dubbed with them into American accents. And much to our shame, Mel Gibson, who was born in America, his voice was spoken by someone else. Hugh Keys Burns, who played the toe cutter from the Royal Shakespeare Company, he was speaking with a Southern American accent. All these years later, there was never any question of someone of using the Australian accent.
So what's changed? What's allowed that?
Culture.
The supremacy.
Culture. It's people are aware of when I first went to America, I think other people in 1976. People were surprised when I said I came from Australia. They were surprised we spoke English. They mix us up with Austrians. Yeah, and so they were surprised. Oh, you speak English, and that's what it was back then. Since then, in the 80s, we had, of course, the Crocodile Dundees, so many of our TV shows, and most importantly, our actors and filmmakers who went over there had to adjust their accents to American accents, and now you hear them all talking with Australian accents. In fact, people are asking for us to do things with Australian accents. That's 40 years of cultural evolution, and I think it's one of the functions of our own stories going out somewhere. So, just to go back to your original question, this film is unmistakably Australian, arising something that's universal in basically tapping into the universality, let's say, of all storytelling, but with a specific Australian bent on it.
And do you, as well as the accent, do you feel the Australianness, the kind of the wit, the vibe, as being Australian?
I do. There's a there is a wit. There is a sort of sarcasm, a sort of self-deprecation to the language and the sort of individuals sort of talking, but there's also something incredibly unique. So the first thing that struck me when I read the script was there was a sort of poetry to the language and a sort of rhythm there that felt, again, unlike anything. It didn't feel American, it didn't feel English, it didn't feel Australian. There was a sort of a, like same way when you read sort of Shakespeare and it's like, oh, it's English, but it's not the English I know. There was something different, and that was, I don't know how you guys came up with that. I never asked you, but there is a sort of a poetic sort of nature to the verbiage and the language in the film.
I don't want to ask about the future because the present is much too important at the moment, but you have said that you are most proud of your performance in Dementus, of all the work that you've done. Would you like to stay inside this wonderful ongoing saga.
I said,
don't do him again.
No.
He dies.
He's done.
Oh no,
yeah.
he hasn't died. No.
No, he's not dead.
I mean, I think I was proud's a funny word. I was incredibly grateful for the experience. It was the most enjoyable experience of my career. You know, how it's received is up to everybody else. But my experience was creatively just so much fun working with George and the opportunity and to have such detail and depth within the script and you know. At every corner and every turn, we're able to sort of say, well, we could go this way. What if we tried this? And there was sort of no limitations with it. And I hadn't experienced that before. So I would like to hang on to and do somewhere.
And you had your own horde of motorbike riders.
I had my own horde of motorbike riders.
Got to be one of the great joys of the world, right?
Yes.
It was an eclectic group of people too. It was a fun gang.
Without taking too much time, have you ever seen a picture? There's a picture that someone showed me of the motorbike riders from the first Mad Max, and they had a dog called Wonder Dog, and it was a dog that rode with the bike again. It appears in the first Mad Max, and in the picture there's several of these they were called the Vigilante Biker Group. They were long-haired, often bearded. They were basically fun riders. They weren't like a criminal biker gang. And in the back of the picture, there was a guy called Craig Hemsworth. His dad, and have you seen the picture?
No, I haven't even.
He's there. He's got a smile. He's got long hair, and he's got a smile. And I swear, he looks exactly like you, with long hair. And he was one of the people who looked after Wonder Dog, this amazing dog that only would hang out with bikers and go follow anyone home, anyone of the biker group, would ride on the back of the bike. And your father wasn't in the film because he was already, I don't know if he was just out of university doing social work, but he couldn't do the film. But he knew.
He raced motorbikes, so he knew all of that group and all those guys. And
Just finally, I just wanted to ask this.
Wild.
Because
I'll show you the picture.
It was in the stars, but finally I want to ask this question just about Mad Max as a phenomenon, because I've heard you talk about film being about giving and taking from the zeitgeist. How do you have a zeitgeist that endures over decades?
Because on the one hand, even though there's rapid change, humankind is always changing. It's almost to the point where we can barely grasp it, and there's bewilderment. But there's some things that are constant. There's some behaviour patterns, which because we're basically evolved over probably, let's say, 150,000 years into the modern version of the human, and those patterns are constant across all time and place. I mean, so they're very, very interesting stories to tell, because they're not only about some dystopian future, they basically refer to past behaviours. Everything that you see in the film is not only something you can find variations of in history, but you also find them in the news in the news today. And so they are a way of both reflecting on who we were, I think, and probably inviting conversation about who we are and maybe where we're going. That's the function of allegory, and that's all stories. Even a really great news story has an allegorical quality. A great joke, told by an anecdote or stand-up comedian, has a level of allegory. That's one of the ways we identify them. Every fairy tale, every fable, every biblical story, every holy book story, every folklore has that same ingredient. It's not me. The person who articulated this by far the best was Joseph Campbell. But that's the function of story. We basically share our experiences and try to make sense of it through story. This is just another variation on that.
Thank you for creating a wonderful story. George Miller will be in your stories for as long as we possibly can. And Chris Hemsworth for a truly magnetic, fascinating, wonderful to watch performance. It was a real joy. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you.